Lucas Meyer had never been the type to make noise. After 30 years working in irrigation and landscaping, he craved peace more than prestige. When he bought the modest one-story house on a quiet street just outside a sleepy southern town, he wasn't chasing reinvention or running from demons. He simply wanted quiet routines. His new home offered exactly that. A backyard big enough to tend, a shed for his tools, and the kind of silence where you could hear your own breath while pushing a mower in the late afternoon. For Lucas, nothing was more grounding than the rhythm of a clean, slow cut across warm grass. He kept things neat without being obsessive. His lawn wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Simple edges, healthy turf, and no gimmicks. It was something you could trust under your feet. Karen Mulgrave lived next door, though lived seemed too passive a word for someone so present. She was large, loud when she chose to be, and carried herself like a parade marshal marching through life with invisible banners waving behind her. Her yard had no grass, only a sprawling web of tangled plants, overgrown shrubs, and what looked like half-dead ornamentals gasping for sunlight. Karen called it rewilding. She also called it a haven for beneficial species, though Lucas suspected it was more a reflection of her stubbornness than any love for bees. Their first interaction was brief. He waved from his driveway. She didn't wave back. She just looked at him, squinting like he was a glare in her windshield. No words, no nod, just an unsettling stillness before she turned and walked inside. He let it go. Neighbors didn't have to be friends, and he wasn't here to win hearts. But over the weeks, he noticed small things. Karen staring from behind a curtain as he adjusted his sprinkler heads. Karen marking her property line with bright orange string that ran in awkward loops along their shared edge. Karen walking the perimeter of her yard each morning at dawn, dragging a rake behind her like a sentry. He never responded, never confronted, never even mentioned it to anyone when he went into town for supplies, but still, there was a weight to it. Not fear, but pressure. A sense that peace here came with a silent tax, paid in tolerance and distance. Then came the Tuesday. It was warm, not hot, and Lucas was mowing. The motor was loud enough to drown out the world, so he didn't hear the footsteps. He didn't sense the movement. He only felt the sudden, jarring thud. Metal against bone, a white-hot crack in the curve of his shoulder blade. He stumbled forward, barely keeping his grip on the mower's handle. Behind him, a steel thermos rolled to a stop on the freshly cut grass. Lucas stood still for a second, the pain tightening his throat. Then he turned. Karen was there at the edge of her yard, arms crossed, face unreadable. No apology, no surprise. Just a grim, satisfied silence that said everything and nothing at once. Lucas didn't say a word. He didn't curse, didn't shout, didn't even reach for the thermos still lying in the grass like a weapon discarded after a clean strike. He simply looked at it, then at Karen, whose expression remained flat, almost tranquil. Then he turned, gripped the mower with both hands, and pushed it forward. The wheels bumped once over the orange string she'd laid weeks ago, then once more over the edge of her unkempt flower bed. The blades caught the first of the wild plants, a tall, stringy stalk with violet flowers, and shredded it without resistance. The mower screamed slightly louder as it met the denser growth, dirt and petals erupting like confetti beneath its deck. Lucas didn't steer. He didn't pause. He pushed until the machine stood square in the middle of her garden, then stepped back, let go of the handle, and left the engine spinning. The sound filled the air, raw, mechanical, chaotic, and he walked away past the thermos, past the line, up to his porch, and inside without looking back. He didn't see Karen's reaction, but he heard the sharp snap of a screen door slamming several minutes later. It wasn't until nearly an hour after the mower's engine finally sputtered into silence that a white sedan pulled up and two uniformed responders stepped out. They weren't police, at least not in the traditional sense. Their vests read Community Health Safety Division, a term that had grown increasingly popular in smaller towns where budgets didn't cover full psychiatric units. Lucas met them at the door, his arm still sore but his voice calm. One of them, a wiry man with neatly trimmed sideburns, said they were responding to a wellness check request. The report claimed he'd been behaving erratically, possibly suffering from a mental health crisis, and that he might be a danger to himself or others. Lucas blinked once, nodded slowly, and invited them in. He didn't protest, didn't bristle. He just led them to his kitchen table and calmly explained what happened. that his neighbor had struck him in the back with a steel thermos without warning, that he had reacted instinctively, and that he had not made threats nor brandished any weapons, nor acted in a manner that would justify concern beyond what had already happened. They asked if he had any injury. He said yes and removed his shirt. The man with the sideburns examined the bruise, already purpling beneath the skin, and quietly took out his phone to photograph it with consent. Lucas asked if the report would be available for records. The man nodded. Lucas asked for a copy. The man wrote down a request number. Before they left, one of them asked if he wanted to press charges or have someone contact the neighbor. Lucas said no. Not yet, he added after a moment. But I'd like a copy of your visit in case that changes. They left without incident. He closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the emptiness. The next morning, a sealed envelope appeared in his mailbox. Hand-delivered, no postage. It was a formal complaint from a local property claims adjuster, not on city letterhead but clearly linked to municipal code enforcement. It stated that Karen Mulgrave had filed for property damage compensation, claiming Lucas had trespassed and destroyed valuable protected flora in her designated pollinator zone. The letter warned that further violations could result in legal action and requested his insurance details for potential claims processing. Lucas didn't bother with a phone call. He drove into town, walked into the clinic where he'd done yearly physicals for the past decade, and asked for a walk-in appointment. The physician assistant, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense air, examined his shoulder, documented the injury, and signed a statement of physical harm consistent with a blunt object. Lucas paid cash, got 3 certified copies, and drove home. He scanned everything, photos, letters, statements, and filed them into a folder marked Mulgrave. He didn't speak to her. He didn't glance in her direction, but he knew she was watching. The mower, still caked in dirt and flower pulp, sat where he had left it the day before, at the exact spot where his lawn ended and hers began. By evening, it was gone, not pushed back onto his side, not returned. Just gone. Vanished. Lucas didn't ask questions. He just replaced it the next day with a newer, louder model, and mowed his side as though nothing had happened. The air between the houses shifted after that. Not colder, just more electric. Karen had moved from passive to active, and Lucas had answered without raising his voice. But now the machinery had started turning, slow and deliberate. She had entered a system she thought would work in her favor. A bureaucracy of complaints, forms, accusations, assuming he would either bow or break. What she didn't count on was that Lucas had lived through this kind of pressure before. Not violence exactly, but sustained tension, the kind that frays people and makes them slip up. And he wasn't going to slip. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking for closure. He was looking for distance. And if he couldn't get it physically, he would carve it with documentation, one quiet page at a time. Lucas understood something had shifted the moment the silence became tactical. The bruising on his back had begun to fade, but in its place, a new presence had moved in. The heavy stillness of scrutiny. He didn't see Karen much in the days that followed, but he felt her. Not through any dramatic confrontation or loud assertion, but through the way her absence now hung with intent. Her curtains didn't flutter accidentally anymore. They parted in rhythm like clockwork, during moments when he stepped outside, as though she were cataloging his behavior. The orange string marking her property line was replaced by a low wire fence, barely knee-height, not tall enough to keep anything out, but just high enough to make sure he saw it. One morning, Lucas noticed she had posted a laminated sign near the border. It read, "No trespassing rehabilitation zone." The wording was vague, but the implication was clear. Approach and you will answer for it. Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he spent a full weekend rerouting his irrigation system so that no sprinkler head faced her direction. He repositioned his tools, installed motion-sensitive lights facing only his side of the yard, and logged every letter, document, or notice in a separate binder. He printed timestamps. He copied receipts. He called his insurance provider and disclosed the ongoing dispute, not as a claim, but as a potential exposure. The representative was sympathetic, almost amused. "This kind of neighbor thing?" she said. "It usually dies down." Lucas only replied, "She threw a steel thermos at my back." The line went silent for a moment. The rep took his information, made a note, and told him to call immediately if anything escalated. He saved her number under defense. The next week, the pressure changed again. It arrived not with noise, but with rot. Lucas opened his shed early one morning to find a pile of composting organic waste dumped just inside. Onion skins, half-melted watermelon rinds, egg cartons soaked through with moisture, and what he assumed had once been cabbage now liquefied into a congealed smear. It wasn't from raccoons. The placement was too central, too deliberate. It hadn't been dropped. It had been arranged. He stood there for a long time, the door open. The smell thick in the air. He didn't clean it immediately. He photographed it every angle, then backed out and called a private sanitation service. When the worker arrived, a lanky man with a truck that smelled worse than the pile, Lucas offered him double to write a statement, confirming that the mess wasn't accidental wildlife interference. The man shrugged, nodded, wrote it down. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his bed and stared at the hallway, unsure if what kept him alert was the memory of the smell or the knowledge that someone had crossed into his space. At 3 a.m, he stepped outside in bare feet, walked to the middle of his lawn, and looked at her house. Nothing stirred. No light, no movement. Just that same sloping garden, dense and wild, humming with the kind of quiet that felt staged. He returned inside, poured a glass of water, and sat at his table until dawn. When the sun broke through the blinds, he drafted a letter, short, precise, and entirely factual, summarizing the events to date. He sent it by registered mail to a local legal office, a general practice firm with a reputation for neighbor disputes. He didn't expect them to act yet. He just wanted a footprint, proof that something had started. 2 days later, a small plastic container of roofing nails appeared on his driveway. They weren't scattered, but dumped, a pile right behind his rear tires, neatly positioned. Lucas didn't touch them. He stepped around them, took his phone, photographed every angle, then called the same private firm that had cleaned his shed. This time, he asked them to remove the nails and provide a certificate of hazardous materials disposal. The man on the phone paused, asked if there had been an accident. Lucas simply said, "I want chain of custody." The paperwork arrived with a courier 2 days later. He began to notice more subtle changes. Mail arriving with water damage despite no rain. A package sliced open at the bottom but not removed. A local delivery man warned him that someone had asked questions about his schedule, claiming to be a concerned relative. Lucas didn't react. He added the interaction to his notes, saved it under a new tab titled Contact Points. He wasn't paranoid, he was methodical. There was a difference, and he knew it well. One morning, returning from the hardware store, he caught a flicker of movement near the side of his garage. Too fast to identify, but too late to ignore. He walked the perimeter and found nothing. No footprints, no tools missing. But something had changed. His exterior water valve had been turned slightly open, causing a slow leak that soaked the soil in a concentrated patch near his foundation. It hadn't been a child's prank. Someone wanted him distracted, worried, frayed. He called the local precinct, not to file a report, but to log a disturbance concern. The officer who answered sounded half-interested, until Lucas explained the previous injury, the ongoing documentation, and the escalating acts. The tone shifted. "I'm not telling you to press charges," the officer said. "But if this keeps going, don't wait too long to build your side of the story. It's always better to come in clean than play catch-up after the mess." Lucas wrote down the officer's badge number, saved the call log, and added the time to his timeline. Then he went outside and installed a new valve cover. Metal, keyed, uncuttable. That same evening, his porch light flickered. At first, he assumed it was a power fluctuation, but when he went to inspect the fixture, he found the bulb missing. Not broken. Removed. Placed neatly upside down on the porch rail like a chess piece waiting for its move. He picked it up, weighed it in his palm, then set it inside a plastic bag and sealed it. He didn't know if it mattered, but he also didn't care. This wasn't about proof anymore. This was about readiness. The kind of readiness that didn't need justification. The kind that grew in silence and waited. Karen didn't reappear. Not physically, not vocally, but her garden expanded. Lucas noticed new stakes in the soil, larger boundary markers, freshly clipped tags fluttering in the wind. He didn't cross them. He didn't even approach. He just made sure his mower didn't graze an inch past his own side, and when he edged his lawn, he kept a 2-foot buffer, measured and marked. He gave her more space than she asked for because now it wasn't about the lawn. It was about drawing a line he would never need to cross again. Not because he was afraid, but because she already had. It wasn't the garden that finally brought it to a head, nor the silent provocations or the scattered signs that had started to appear at the edge of the property, like vague warnings from an invisible authority. It was the fence. Not a real fence. Nothing official, nothing submitted through the proper municipal channels. Just a series of mismatched panels and salvaged pickets that appeared overnight along the border between Lucas's yard and Karen's property. They didn't connect fully, weren't even anchored properly, just wedged into the earth with bricks, tree limbs, and 2x4s, all painted in a chaotic mix of pastels and primer white. It wasn't a structure, it was a message, and it screamed without sound. The following morning, Lucas stood in the doorway, coffee cooling in his hand, staring at the absurdity of it all. The way the panels leaned like crooked teeth, some already tilting from their own weight, others etched with words that made no legal sense but were meant to imply restriction: do not enter, protected zone, land under observation. One panel even had the phrase territorial right scrawled in all caps. It was like she'd built a shrine to boundary paranoia. Lucas didn't photograph it this time. He didn't need to. The panels were within her line, technically, at least where she had redrawn that line with her chaotic plantings. He knew what this was, an escalation not of law but of perception. She was trying to create reality through saturation, layers of gesture and obstruction until the original order was too buried to unearth. And it was working to a degree. Every time Lucas looked at his own lawn, he felt the weight of that chaos leaning in. But it didn't move him to anger. Not now. Now it moved him to act. That afternoon, he visited his attorney for the first formal meeting. Not a consultation, not a casual inquiry. An official session to review documentation and begin what the firm called a structured dispute pathway. He brought his binder, his receipts, his photos, and most importantly, his copy of the medical evaluation. The lawyer, a woman in her late 50s with a clipped tone and zero tolerance for nonsense, thumbed through everything without comment until she reached the report about the Thermos. She tapped the page, looked up, and asked, "And she's never been charged?" Lucas shook his head. No one even knocked on her door. The lawyer sighed, set the folder down, and said, "That's going to change." By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a 3-stage approach. First, formal notification of pending civil action delivered through a third-party process server. Second, a petition for a protective order to prevent further provocation or encroachment. Third, a review of municipal code to challenge the legality of the fence structure. "We're not going to win by yelling," she told him. "We're going to win by pushing paper until she's buried in it." Lucas nodded. He wasn't interested in revenge. He just wanted it to stop. That night, a new motion light he had installed near his driveway clicked on just past midnight. Lucas was awake, sitting in the living room reading. He moved to the window but didn't draw the curtain. Instead, he waited. A figure appeared near the fence. Tall, round, unmistakably Karen. She wasn't carrying tools or flashlights this time. She was simply walking, slowly, dragging what looked like a tangle of wind chimes behind her. When she reached the center panel, she began to hang them, piece by piece, letting them clink and rattle as the night wind stirred. It was ceremonial, almost theatrical. Lucas didn't interrupt. He didn't go outside. He watched her finish, retreat, and vanish into her house. The chimes kept ringing long after she disappeared. The next day, the noise began in earnest. The chimes weren't tuned. They were jagged, clashing metal, the kind you'd find in discount bins or salvage yards. Every breeze now brought a chaotic symphony of metallic shrieking that bled through windows, through walls. Lucas recorded it, not for the volume, but for the duration. He documented 3 hours straight where the noise never dipped below a sustained 40-decibel threshold. His lawyer sent a notice that same afternoon. Within days, a municipal inspector arrived to evaluate ambient environmental disruption. The inspector didn't even hide his annoyance. "I've seen junkyards quieter than this," he muttered as he scribbled into his clipboard. Karen, of course, didn't answer the door. That night, someone slashed the tires of Lucas's mower. He found it in the morning. 2 tires deflated, the rubber gouged in straight, precise lines. There was no note, no trace, no spray paint, just damage. Targeted, intentional, and timed to follow the inspection. He didn't call the police. He didn't knock on Karen's door. He called a tow truck, had the mower picked up, repaired, and documented the entire process with timestamps and receipts. By noon, his lawyer had added a line item to the ongoing civil complaint under malicious property interference. What shifted everything wasn't a single event, but a voice. One that didn't belong to Karen or Lucas. A neighbor. A man Lucas had barely spoken to, who lived across the street and had until now remained utterly uninvolved. One morning, while Lucas was hosing down the front walkway, the man stepped across his driveway, coffee in hand, and said quietly, "She tried this with the guy before you. Ran him out in less than a year. I think he just broke and sold the place." Lucas stopped spraying, turned toward him, unsure whether to engage or just nod and let it pass. But the man continued, "I'm not picking sides. I don't like trouble. But I'm telling you, don't try to reason with her. Paper's the only thing she understands." Lucas didn't reply, but something settled in him. Confirmation, maybe, or just validation that this wasn't imagined. He finished hosing down the pavement, locked the gate, and went inside. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the wind picked up again, he heard the chimes stir into their grating chorus. He didn't flinch. He didn't look. He just went to the kitchen, sat down at the table, opened his laptop, and began compiling every document into a single master file. It wasn't vengeance. It was preparation. The storm had passed its halfway point, and now he would face the rest of it like a man who had already withstood the worst. Lucas had always known the second wave would be worse. The first round was scattered, emotional, chaotic, all frayed edges and noise. But this next phase unfolded with a precision that spoke not of spontaneity, but of calculation. Karen had escalated her tactics not by volume, but by structure. If before her attacks were wild swings in the dark, now they came with teeth, paper, and official headers. It started with the envelope. Not certified, no court seal. Just a thick white letter tucked into his mailbox on a Thursday morning, bearing the address of a law firm across town. One he'd heard of, but never had dealings with. The language was slippery, intentionally so. Claims of emotional distress, hostile environmental conditions, continued disregard for residential harmony. At the bottom was a polite but firm suggestion that Lucas consider mediation. An attempt, it said, to resolve this matter amicably before more formal remedies become necessary. He read it twice, then made 3 copies and sent them to his attorney with a short message. "It's begun." Her response came within the hour, measured, direct, and loaded with subtext. "Expected. Do not reply. We respond through filings only. I'll handle the language." Lucas didn't. He went back to his yard, his tools, his work. But he wasn't relaxed anymore. The serenity he once carved out of green lines and trimmed edges had been replaced with a taut awareness, a tension that pulsed behind his ribs even when the world outside looked calm. That weekend, he noticed something peculiar. New faces on the street. 2 people he didn't recognize. One walking a dog that didn't walk so much as loiter, sniffing deliberately at the edges of his driveway. The other standing at the corner, phone in hand, pointed too long in his direction before making a show of checking messages. Lucas didn't react, didn't confront. He waved once, and when neither waved back, he filed it away with the rest of the new data. The following Monday, a formal complaint was submitted to the local zoning committee. Karen accused Lucas of unpermitted alterations to his irrigation system, citing potential water runoff violations and improper drainage that could compromise her protected garden ecosystem. She attached photos, zoomed in, grainy, clearly taken from her upstairs window, and framed the complaint as an environmental concern. Lucas received a notice in the mail 2 days later, informing him that a representative would be visiting his property for an assessment within 10 business days. He called his attorney immediately. "She's exploiting process," she said. "It's not illegal, but it's manipulative. You'll be ready." And he was. By the time the city official arrived, Lucas had already retained a certified landscaping inspector who had walked the full system, checked the drain angles, and submitted a notarized report confirming full compliance with all local codes. Lucas handed the report to the official before the man even stepped onto the lawn. The inspection took under 10 minutes. The official left with an apologetic nod, and Lucas stood at the fence line, hands in his pockets, as Karen stared from her porch without blinking. But she wasn't done. The next morning, 3 neighbors received anonymous letters containing edited photos of Lucas's yard. Some digitally altered to look like he had removed fencing, others implying he had dumped chemical agents along the border. One of the neighbors, a retired postal worker who had always nodded politely but never engaged in gossip, handed the letter to Lucas and said, "I don't buy this crap, but someone's trying real hard to make you look like a pest." Lucas thanked him, scanned the letter, and added it to his growing archive. That night, the wind shifted. Literally. A sharp gust carried a heavy, acrid scent over the fence line, burned rubber, or maybe plastic. Lucas walked the edge of his property and found a small metal container, smoldering in the grass behind his tool shed. Inside was a melted tangle of wires and what looked like the remains of a battery pack. It hadn't ignited fully, but it had burned long enough to leave a black ring in the grass. He didn't touch it. He called the fire marshal, who came within the hour, examined the container, and filed an incident report. "Could have been worse," he said. "But yeah, this wasn't trash." Lucas didn't sleep that night. He paced. He wrote. He adjusted his security system to cover new blind spots and moved all his tools indoors. The next morning, he found Karen kneeling in her garden, humming tunelessly as she pruned already dead branches from a leafless bush. She didn't look up when he passed. She didn't have to. The act was theatrical, like everything she did now, a performance for an audience she imagined or needed. Then came the letter from the insurance company. Karen had filed a claim against Lucas's homeowner's policy, alleging structural damage to the soil integrity on her side of the property. The language was dense, speculative, and relied on obscure environmental assessments that didn't exist. But the claim was real, and it triggered an internal audit. An inspector scheduled a visit. Lucas complied. He offered full access, documentation, digital blueprints of his system. The inspector spent an hour on site, reviewed everything, and then, off the record, said quietly, "This isn't about damage. This is someone trying to build a case against you, one grain of sand at a time." By then, Lucas's lawyer had submitted the formal complaint, a counterclaim alleging targeted harassment, malicious misrepresentation, defamation, and private nuisance. The filing was thick, bound in blue, and delivered directly to Karen's legal counsel. Lucas didn't gloat. He didn't speak, but he was present when the courier crossed her driveway. He watched from his porch, face unreadable as the envelope was handed over the threshold. Karen stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy cardigan, her arms crossed over her chest, staring down at the blue-bound stack like it might detonate. The battle had moved beyond words, beyond fences, beyond bruises and noise. Now it was a war of records, of silence, of who could prove the other existed as a threat. And Lucas was no longer flinching. He was methodical, prepared, and just beginning to tighten the noose made of paper, law, and time. The week leading up to the hearing unfolded with an eerie calm, the kind of stillness that made Lucas uneasy, not because anything bad had happened, but because nothing did. Karen hadn't been seen in days. Her yard, once a chaotic shrine of overgrown foliage and aggressively placed ecological markers, now sat untouched, drying at the edges under the unrelenting summer sun. The wind chimes she'd once hung like cursed ornaments had been taken down one by one, leaving rust-streaked shadows on the makeshift fence panels. For the first time since the beginning of the conflict, Lucas woke to silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that made your instincts lean forward and wait for the blow. He didn't trust it. Neither did his lawyer. They met the day before the hearing to review final documentation, and she was meticulous. Every statement had been signed, every incident cataloged with dates, times, photos, third-party affidavits, environmental assessments, and repair invoices. What had started as a dispute over lawn space and thrown thermoses had evolved into a fully fledged legal construct, a layered and airtight record of harassment, property interference, and emotional endangerment. "We don't need to humiliate her," the lawyer had said. "We just need to show the pattern. Judges respond to patterns. Lucas agreed. He didn't want spectacle. He wanted cessation. The morning of the hearing, Lucas arrived early and sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, in a suit he hadn't worn since a wedding 5 years ago. The building smelled of old wood and government air, stale, processed, and dry. He kept the file beside him, unopened, hands folded over his knees, calm in posture but internally bracing. Karen arrived 15 minutes before the session. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, sunglasses, and a shawl that wrapped around her like she was shielding herself from more than the air conditioning. She was alone. Her lawyer, a man who looked like he'd been pulled from a mediation brochure, walked 2 steps behind her, expression tight, gaze avoiding Lucas entirely. She didn't look at him either. Not then. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was professional but heavy, the kind of quiet that comes when people sense something underneath the surface. Lucas's attorney presented their case without flourish, just precision. She laid out the injury report, the subsequent escalation, the coordinated pattern of passive-aggressive and direct acts, the strategic abuse of municipal and legal channels, and finally, the personal cost. Time, money, and the erosion of peace that every citizen was supposed to be entitled to within the boundaries of their own home. She presented the fire marshal's report, the landscape inspector's analysis, the photos of vandalism and damage. Each piece layered into the next, like bricks in a wall that couldn't be scaled. When Karen's turn came, her lawyer made the mistake of leaning into emotional language. He spoke of discomfort, of being a target in her own neighborhood, of feeling watched and unsafe due to the presence of surveillance cameras, which he argued created a climate of intimidation. But he had no medical reports, no police reports, no environmental assessments of his own. Just her words, shaky and often contradictory, laced with dramatic pauses that sounded more rehearsed than lived. When the judge finally asked her to speak, she removed her glasses and tried to appear vulnerable, but her voice lacked rhythm. She tried to paint Lucas as vindictive, unapproachable, strange. He never smiled, never waved. It was like he was waiting for something to go wrong. The courtroom remained still. The judge asked a single question. Did you ever report him for threatening behavior before the Thermos incident? Karen stammered. No, but he made me feel... That's not what I asked, the judge interrupted. By the time the arguments ended, the mood had turned. The judge, a man in his 60s with the voice of someone long past theatrics, delivered his decision without delay. The protective order was granted in favor of Lucas. Karen was ordered to cease all indirect contact, including surveillance, messaging, or third-party involvement, and to remove the fence panels that extended into any disputed boundaries within 10 days. The court also acknowledged the legitimacy of Lucas's counterclaim and ruled in favor of limited damages for property repair and emotional disruption, pending further review. She had lost, not explosively, not humiliatingly, but definitively. Outside the courtroom, Lucas didn't look at her. He walked past her without a glance, holding the file loosely in one hand, like something he no longer needed to clutch. Karen stood by the wall, the shawl still wrapped around her, a thin line of sweat visible at her temple beneath the hat brim. Her lawyer leaned in to say something, but she didn't respond. She just stared ahead, unmoving, lips pressed into a tight line, as if the silence had finally turned on her and she didn't know how to speak anymore. Lucas stepped outside into the bright sun, and for the first time in months, he exhaled without tension in his shoulders. The following week, the fence was gone. Not neatly disassembled or reclaimed, but hacked apart, broken wood stacked on the curb like discarded trash. The wind chimes never returned. Her garden began to recede into overgrowth again, the controlled chaos collapsing into unmanaged wilderness. She didn't come out much after that. Lucas saw her once, maybe twice, through the window, sitting alone in the back with no tools, no gloves, no movement. Just stillness. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He replaced 2 security cameras, reseeded a patch of damaged lawn, and repaired the gate hinge that had warped in the heat. But what he didn't do was look toward her house. He didn't need to. The worst was over. Not because the drama had ended, but because the momentum had shifted entirely out of her hands, and the law had finally moved the weight of consequence where it belonged. By mid-autumn, the air had cooled, and the neighborhood, once humming with tension beneath its trimmed hedges and painted shutters, had returned to its regular rhythm. The sound of rakes scraping leaves, children riding bikes after school, and sprinklers clicking in the early mornings replaced the metallic screech of wind chimes and the quiet drama that had lingered like a storm cloud over the property line. Lucas resumed his routines, not with caution or defensiveness, but with the steady precision of someone who had lived through a siege and understood the importance of reclaiming peace on his own terms. The morning mowings returned, the quiet afternoon repairs on the shed resumed, and the kitchen lights glowed warmly well past dusk, a steady pulse of ordinary life. Karen, meanwhile, faded. Her yard returned to something resembling a forgotten lot, its once defiant plantings now strangled by weeds and neglect. The rehabilitation zone sign had long since disappeared, the handmade fence stripped down and hauled away in pieces. Sometimes Lucas thought he saw her at the window, just the flicker of a curtain or the shape of a figure standing too long in one place. But she never came out. No letters, no complaints, no more shadows cast over his driveway in the early hours. It was like she'd melted into the bones of the house, withdrawn from the very conflict she had once clung to like a performance. Lucas never spoke to her again, not out of spite, but because nothing needed to be said. Some wars ended not with truces or apologies, but with silence, with one side finally understanding it had lost more than it could defend. When the first frost came, Lucas stood at the edge of his yard, shovel in hand, ready to turn the soil and prepare it for winter cover. For a moment, he glanced toward the overgrown border where her garden used to spill through the gap between lots, and then, without hesitation, turned away. He planted a row of red-twig dogwood, dense, beautiful in winter, and known for growing into strong, natural boundaries. He didn't do it to provoke. He did it to reclaim. As he watered the roots, a neighbor passed by on the sidewalk, a man who had once avoided eye contact during the height of the tension. This time, he paused and gave a quiet nod. "Looks good," he said. Lucas only replied, "It'll hold." And it would. Not just the shrubs, but everything. The ground, the routine, the life he had resecured not by fighting louder, but by refusing to be moved.